You are listening to Fika with Vicky on United Public Radio, 107.7 and 105.3 from New Orleans.
Everyone, and welcome to Fika. Our guest today is Tory Kokoska. Tory is the author of the freshly released Bogowie, a study of Eastern Europeans' ancient gods. It has fairy tales, folklore, and a whole lot of snake, dragon, and sibling drama. Don't smile, Troy. It's true. I may or may not be having nightmares about being a snake woman and being with a stick. But I think the real adventure behind Bogowie took place outside of its pages. I can't imagine the dedication and energy it took to delve into this subject and come up with such an all-encompassing work. If you are interested in myths and legends of Eastern Europe because of your heritage, or if you are interested because it provides the background for your chosen fandom, or even if you just can't get enough of fairy tales, which would be me, you'll want to take a look at Bogowie. In fact, you'll probably want to take more than one look, as I'm sure it will become a favorite reference source. Thank you, Troy, for sharing your work, your insights, and your conclusions on this subject, and perhaps encouraging us to do the same. Welcome to Fika.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I apologize if dragons or snakes are something that can give you nightmares.
Well, just they tend to, the women that have a certain attitude tend to turn into snakes and be punished for it, into snake women. And it's possible I have that attitude, Troy. So I was taking it personally. No, I'm not really having nightmares about them. And I kind of side with dragons and snakes on occasion. Before we get into this big work that you've done called Bogowie, maybe you could just tell us a little about what encouraged you to write it, the whys, and even for some of us, what Bogowie means.
Sure. So, when you're talking about the culture of Eastern Europe, obviously, a lot of that has tended to be glossed over. Interest in Slavic studies, I think I was just mentioning that, it's sort of, it was very high in the West during the Cold War, but then it sort of ebbed. And, it is something that deserves a spotlight because, like I say, the Slavic language speakers make up about, a little over a third of Europe by population. And if you're talking about geography, they occupy about half of it. And, a lot of the folklore and a lot of the pre-Christian stuff is a huge chunk of their traditional culture. Some of it's very ancient, and I try to show that, you can actually prove how ancient some of this stuff is if you really delve into it. But then a lot of it also survived up to fairly recent times. Some of the traditions that I describe, or some of the stories that I describe, really were still being circulated, well into the early 20th century. And there's obviously revival attempts ongoing today, even. And yeah, it's worth noting, Bogowie means gods, and one of the reasons I wanted to sort of harken back to that Slavic word for gods or deity is that that's actually a borrowing from an Iranian language. Specifically, it's supposed to come from the Scythians or Sarmatians. And I felt like that was a good word to home in on because it sort of shows the mixed origins of Eastern European culture, even going way back into ancient times.
Okay, so you talk a lot about how all of these things interchanged in the area. This could come from there, and this could come from here. Threes were more popular in certain areas, and twos and twins were more popular in other areas. And you talked about paralleling or borrowing from different cultures. Can you give us an idea of what you mean by those things?
Right. So, talking about pairs versus triads, that's something that actually has to do with a type of folktale. So, a lot of people, if you read folktales, you've probably read stories of Arn Thompson type 303, should be 303, blood brothers, basically. And this is from the Arn Thompson Index, which is basically like an index of international folktale types. And if you've read stories of this type, a lot of times it's with two brothers, but sometimes it can also be with three brothers. So it's, you would classify these stories as the same type, but the number isn't necessarily consistent. Now, as far as borrowings or parallels, that can be hard to say because, one of the things I show is that, Europe has a lot of shared history going back 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. So, I mean, if you find two things that are similar, it doesn't necessarily mean that one group borrowed them from the other. It could be that they both got it from some even older source. So that's one way that I would distinguish borrowings from parallels. A parallel doesn't necessarily mean that they actually got it, that one got it directly from the other. It could be a lot more complicated than that.
So, for example, when it comes to history, you know, was there travel involved, or did it just, South America and Egypt come up with the idea of pyramids at about the same time? It's like that. And that is completely possible because as people grow, they sort of shift into the same understandings, right? So you can be growing here and come up with the same stories without it actually having to be brought to the other one, right?
Yeah, you can definitely have parallels for a number of reasons, even coincidence in some cases. Although I do make the case that a lot of European countries do have shared history going back thousands of years. I even get into the DNA studies to some extent, showing that yes, there is a lot of shared heritage there.
So you said you wanted to talk about the fairy tales, and since that's my favorite part, we're definitely going to do that. Now, in the story, one of the things that stood out for me, in the story of which was here but disappeared. Yes. Okay. The three fairies in Sleeping Beauty, right? You and I had never thought about this because you were just so much more intelligent than me. And you looked at this. The three fairies you compared to, for example, the Norns, which we discussed a couple of weeks ago, or the Fates, that they gave Sleeping Beauty her beauty, her, the things that they gave her. And I think that I just think that's great. I am just bowled away by that idea that I never thought of before. So this Sleeping Beauty is something that we're familiar with. But there was a story that you had in the book, and I'm going to say her name wrong, I'm sure. Baba Yaga and Felissa.
Oh, sorry.
How do you
who?
say it? Valilissa?
Oh,
Baba Yaga and
Vasilisa?
see, I'm completely off.
Oh, okay.
Vasilisa,
You're
the
not the only
fair.
one. Yeah.
There were a lot of words to look up, and I just sort of gave up people and said, you know what? I'm okay with being corrected.
Yeah, so that's distantly related to the name Basil. So, Basil in Russian becomes Vasily, and then the feminine form is Vasilisa.
Vasilisa. We're going to learn a lot today, boys and girls. So, and that is very much a Cinderella story. That comparatively, I would say. I haven't got but would you compare it to Cinderella?
Yeah, there are cases where you have so the same story type that I dwell on with Baba Yaga, which is the kind girl and the unkind girl, sometimes getting paired with Cinderella, which is, if you're talking about the folktale index, is a different story, but they do tend to kind of get tied together. So I would say that's a real thing.
I like coming up with real things.
Yeah.
It always amazes me. And yes, but I am going to say that this fairy tale is a lot more earthy and a lot more gritty than I think that Cinderella was even in the original Grimm version, okay? Because we have Baba Yaga, and she is the star. So much going on in this thing. So we have skulls with candles in it. We have people bones being crushed. We have all of these things. And it just, like I found with many of the fairy tales, they are just very earthy, dealing with real things. And well, maybe candles and skulls, I hope, is not a real thing, but it's just a very earthiness to them. Is that because of the area they come from, or is that because you've taken it back to that time, or what you think?
Well, I do try to home in on the folk tales that I think are oldest, or at least have the oldest foundations. So I mean that could be some of it as well. It's really hard to say how far back a lot of these narratives go, but I certainly try to show that they show signs of going back, over 1,000 years or more. And some of it also is the place that they come from. I think Russian folktales definitely have that tendency. And Russian, peasants in particular, they kind of were, I don't want to say they were cut off, because obviously people did interfere in their affairs, but they had a lot more isolation than a lot of people did. So in a way, they were allowed to be independent, at least when they sat around the fire telling stories. There wasn't really a lot of censorship. There wasn't really a lot of intervention from, the outside world. So they could kind of tell the stories that they liked. That's how I imagine it anyway.
And I think I would love stories around the fire with candles and skulls. Okay. It's terrific. I think it's important that we let people know that what your goal was to find the indigenous factor behind this, to take the stories back as far as you could take them, to try to get to the original ones, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you might say that it's impossible to actually prove that a folktale is old, because it gets recorded usually like around the 19th century. So I mean, how could you show how old it is? But I do show that a lot of this stuff can be cross-referenced against things that we know are old. Like a good example would be parallels that I draw between Baba Yaga and the Kaliak in Celtic mythology. And we know that the Kaliak is an ancient figure. She first appears in medieval manuscripts, so there's no way that she could not be ancient, really. So if we find parallels with her, that does raise important questions about the antiquity of these stories.
And I love her. And I think I love all these old goddesses. Just
I love them. Yeah, I
yeah,
can say that.
they're the best. So when we talk, so what you have to do, and which you do in the book, which you can watch it happening, which I like. It's like watching you have a discussion with the paper, but with us about, I saw this and that led me to this, and this led me to. So you show the work. To compare it to a mathematical equation, you showed the work to your conclusions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really hope so.
Yeah, that was the insight and conclusions part of the opening.
Yeah, I mean, there is kind of an issue with the topic of Slavic mythology, where there is a lot of conclusions where the work is not really being shown, and this is partially an attempt to get away from that, because I don't have any problem with people coming to their own conclusions, but when you just sort of say, oh well, this is the conclusion, sometimes it raises questions,
and you're like, but wait, what about this?
Yeah, and in some ways it's better for me to know.
Yeah, no, and to which is okay. I think it's fair at this point that we should announce, we should say your background is in science, and so proving a theory is kind of important to you, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm kind of a weird mix. I think at some point at the beginning, I say that I really like logic. I don't think it's enough on its own. I think there needs to be a balance, but I
But you
like to
can't
know
just
if
leave it behind.
there's a reason for reconstructing something a certain way, like what the rationale is, and I think it does matter though, because for a lot of this stuff, history is a real thing. It actually happened.
It has
There's
facts.
an emotional element to that. The reasons that we feel connected to history are emotional, obviously, but there's also kind of an objective thing as well, because history is a real thing. You can't just make it up. It really did happen a certain way, and I feel like that's important to remember as well.
Well, and when you're looking at, okay, stories change over time to suit the people who are listening to them. As, North American fairy tales have changed from their original source. So, yes, the stories are going to change to suit the people. Whoever is in charge are going to want those stories told in a way that reflects them, right? So, when we talk about reconstructing folklore, fairy tales, what you're having to do is unlayer this back and look at the history and see what might have encouraged certain changes at certain times, right?
Yeah, I would say that's correct.
Okay, see this? I'm winning. Okay. um, but I just wanted to get that that straight. So also in this story, like I saw a lot of reoccurring themes in the stories, right? That may be important themes to the people of that area at that time. So in in the first story I mentioned, Baba Yaga and Vassal, you know who I mean.
Vasilisa, yeah.
Yeah, the good girl, mean girl, the nice girl, mean girl thing. There are 3 riders, and they are the Red Rider, which we're assuming is dusk or evening, right? And the White Rider, who is morning, dawn, and then the Black Rider, that is at night. But later on, you go on to discuss the Zoria sisters, which I probably pronounced wrong, which
That's
are
good.
right, which people will remember because which people will remember from Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and how they would disappear at different times. So that also comes up as the Zoria sisters, that the morning sister, the evening sister, and the night sister. So it is a reoccurring theme. Tell us why it's reoccurring. um, Troy, why was this such an important thing?
Sure. So, I mean, I think I do actually say that I think the triad associated with the cycles of the day is something that might be kind of uniquely Slavic. I mean, I draw a lot of parallels to other cultures, but I really don't see that with a lot of them. I think for some reason in Slavic mythology, there's this concept of a triad, often a triad of goddesses, which is not, unique to the Slavs. But for whatever reason, it seems to be combined with the concept of, the 3 parts of the day, usually morning, midnight, and evening. Sometimes there's different combinations. And yeah, I would definitely link that story with Baba Yaga to the 3 dawn goddesses, or the 3 Zorias. I think you see the clearest hint of that in Romanian folklore, actually, because in Romanian folklore, I mentioned there's a very Baba Yaga-like figure called Muma Paduri, who's basically the mother of the forest, and her 3 daughters are basically the 3 Zorias. One of them is actually called Zorilla, I think. and the other names are Romanian, so I don't remember them. But it's the same basic concept, and so I definitely agree with that interpretation of the three riders going around Baba Yaga's huts being the three goddesses, possibly even her daughters. But then it gets confusing because it can be difficult to distinguish her from her daughters. But that's kind of folklore for you. I would say that the dawn goddess, I argue, well, a lot of scholars have argued, is a concept of the Proto-Indo-European religion, which is a rabbit hole to get into in itself. So, a lot of cultures have this concept of a dawn goddess, and then for some reason the Slavs really liked to attach that to the idea of the triple goddess. And I guess I'm still figuring out why that combination was so meaningful for them.
It it definitely, you can see the threes a lot in the stories, like just looking in. I don't have your insight into it, but there always seems to be three sons, and always there's three sons that this happened to, or the threes. And you do talk a lot about that, talking about the harvest festivals and the grains, the grain coming in, whether it's tied in 3 or 2, or if two apples grow together, or this is all meaningful stuff, which makes sense in those times, because they would be an oddity and you're looking for messages, you're looking to make sense of what is happening, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, I am getting agreed with by a smart guy. I like this. Okay, Brian was here, so
yeah, you're very kind.
So, well, I'm putting you through a lot of work with this pronunciations. So when I talk about the fairy tales, there's 5 major ones that you put as sample tales, but there are poems and parts of things and everything without. And as well, people, when I say he's kind with his references, he is definitely, you can take this and take it further to study however much you want, and it will encourage you to do that. For example, and I've already showed Troy, but I'm so proud of it, I found a copy of Russian Fairy Tales, which was first published in 1943 by Pandem, that has one of the stories that he said was in there at Goodwill for $4.99. Just by the magic, I think the ancient gods were looking out for me when I walked in and found that, because I was like, oh, wow. And so I watch Vikings, and it gave me more insight into the Rus. I'm going to say that wrong. The Rus, and more insight into them and how they came to be and have so much power, and create a certain Norse influence on the stories as well. Right, over the whole cremation thing and burying people. They were like, no, you can't go around burying people. It's just silly. You have to.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting passage.
Yeah. Do you? I thought so. I remembered it. So it gives you insight into that. Any other stories that, if you're into magical romance and not magical romance, magical fiction. I'm not even going to think of the term now. But anyways, any books that you read that use these kind of characters in them, it's good. It really gives you an explanation to a lot of whys and wherefores for them. So if I think it's great. And I'm telling you, it's great. So when we talk about the fairy tales, there is one that, okay, people, I'm going to say, for whatever reason at the time when I read it, it made me cry. So I have toughened myself up here, and I have, so I won't cry in front of anybody. And I have asked Troy if he would read it aloud, and you're okay with that, right, Troy?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay. So this is, and then we'll discuss this story particularly, because it was part of the whole section on death, and wasn't it at the end of that chapter?
All right.
Oh,
So it's the youthful hermit of the Isle of Rachmans. Such, for instance, is one story of the trees, which has been handed down for many ages. There was in the land of Rachmans a great old Sembra pine. Its name is secret. Its name has been passed down from its arboreal foremother. It was still in the youth of its years when it asked the Rachman fathers to give it this name, that it might be written down for remembrance in the monasteries and on the cliffs. So it related to the Rachman elders at Eastertide. So it whispered, my fathers and this Rachman earth have poured juices into me, the juices of salvation. These juices gave me knowledge of that which my ancient fathers knew, and also what has been passed down from the Rachman fathers in the wilderness, what the tree souls and the Rachman souls have whispered to each other. This knowledge was entrusted only to one tree, through a certain being, through a youthful hermit who had entered into an everlasting betrothal with this tree. And so the trees cannot yet rustle together with this knowledge. They do not proclaim it in chorus. I alone preserve it in my resinous blood. It grows in my veins, in my pitch. It extends, it grows strong. And from me, it passes into the souls of the Rachmans. That hermit was a child of God's youth, of the line of stars, of the heavenly luminaries. He descended from the starry worlds by the steps. Like a mountain spring, he revived the world. He reconciled with the world. He soaked himself in the sap of the tree with its branches. He extended thousands of arms to the world. He sent his gaze through the needles and the leaves of the trees. With thousands of green eyes, he looked out on the world, where the sources of youth were hidden. With his gaze, he opened them. With his nod, he concentrated them. He poured youth all through the world in waterfalls. The stars welcomed him as their own. The heavenly choirs exulted in him from the starry cathedrals and altars. Thus he came to the greatest happiness, and then, to his eyes, the green leaves, mournful pictures floated from the most distant worlds, where they do harm to one another and live in despair, where they are tormented and wandering in darkness. Weeping choruses rang to him with their groans. Once more in spirit the seer floated out from the tree and thought, this holiness is not complete. It is not like that of the stars, so long as creatures akin to us are buried in those great darknesses, in that chaos of groans. There is no greater salvation, no greater happiness, than to flame and shine in the darkness. Of all the trees who have become my friends and brothers, the tree of mystery, the trees of wisdom, the trees of fondness, one will be famed most of all, the tree of my cross. And a December pine began to murmur to him, a pine as lofty as the brow of God, an ancient mother pine whose name is secret. I guess thy desire. I will float with thee across the sea, teacher. Take me as the mast of the vessel. Adopt me as thy tree of living, thy tree of dying. The same irons shall pierce my body and thine. Thy blood will mingle with my resin. Then the December pine asked the fathers, the oldest of the Rachmans, to cut her down, to send her by the great river, and by lakes, and down to the sea. The young hermit floated with her. The uplands said farewell to them. They were tumultuous with their blessing. On the shore of the sea was a ship. It had a lofty mast. As a mast like a cross, the pine rose above the waves, as once it had risen above the slope of the upland. It listened to the farewell of the bells. It looked out to the waves, and they sailed by the sun over the great seas, towards Jerusalem, towards Mount Zion. And as they floated, the hermit said to the mast, Sister of secret name, from thee nothing in this world is secret. That is the story told in the Rachman land about the youthful hermit, the unique seer. And so the Rachman hermits pay heed to the stories told by the trees, and they hear the groans from the distant abysses, and wait for the suffering souls to invite them to their festivals, to their sacrificial festivals. But when they know everything from the root to the little leaves rustling highest in the sun, when they have heard the ancient things from before centuries, that which passes in whispers down the generations of the trees, these old men disappear, they depart. No one knows where. No one has come upon their traces. But has anyone sought them? Perhaps in that land they know something, only they do not talk of it, that having overheard the rustle of the sacred Sembra pine, her name is secret, these old men follow in her tracks, that they themselves sail to other lands. in order to renounce happiness, to win new happiness, to be born anew, and to become related to many other families, to pour the Rahman wine into their blood. Until the tree shall give birth to great and numerous stars, until it shall rustle over the world. It will sing, and it will whisper, and it will gaze down at the world in the great firmament. That is what the ancient past has handed down, brother, and so the future will show. Such are the sacred festivals, and such are ours of today.
You have a very nice reading voice. Okay, I'm going to say.
Yeah,
so
I did it.
you did it. Yay! You did it. So I see the Christian influence on this story, but also with the tree. Is there a world tree kind of thing happening as well, like a combination of these two, or what do you think the symbolism is behind these stories?
Yeah, so there are definitely scholars who have argued for there being a world tree in Slavic mythology. You can also find some stories that seem to place a mountain at the center of everything. I'm not sure it's completely consistent, but it does make a lot of sense. And yeah, I also have talked about the Rahmans, which are basically like these supernatural people, really, the deceased, living in this sort of paradise across the sea on an island, which, if you're familiar with Celtic mythology, that should sound very familiar. So every time in that narrative, when they talk about the Rahmans, they are referencing this mythical blessed island. So that's a pre-Christian element. But it is interesting how they sort of combined this pre-Christian notion of paradise with the Christian concept of salvation. And I'm the first to say that I embrace continuity on a lot of levels. I think that's one of the most interesting things about folklore, is the way that it doesn't really abandon the old stuff. It just sort of layers on top of it. And I feel like that's a very, very natural way to approach culture in general, because, it's really rare for anything to really disappear in culture. It seems like oftentimes it just continually layers. And, I would say that I embrace that in a lot of cases.
I think it's natural. You see it all over the world, how one thing they add a thing, they take away a thing as the story continues, but the story does continue. So if you're looking for that indigenous that may have been let us say, looked upon with favor at certain points of time in history, it is being kept hidden and safe at the bottom of all of these layers. And it takes someone like you to start ripping them off. Because sometimes it's nice to go back to the original story, right? In a historical kind of context, in a personal kind of context, if that's your heritage, to understand. Like I always say, when you understand a people's stories, you have a better chance of understanding the people. That's why I think it's so important. And you said, not to quote exactly, because it's a big book, people, and when I was making up the question list, I was not going to go back again and find the exact quote. But you said generally that when there is an absence of a person's individual culture or individuals, that they will fall victim to whatever's happening around them, right? That this
Yeah,
is
I do
important.
talk about that.
And this is your heritage that you were discovering.
Yeah, in large part, yeah.
And did you find what you were looking for?
Yeah, I would say that I have found a lot of it. To give some background, I am half Polish American, and and on my mom's side, I'm also half Jewish, and I feel like that actually kind of informed my approach a little bit, because one of the things that I noticed from my mother's side, and from many of my friends as well, is that cultural identity is not always bad. There are some really very kind people, some really amazing people that cling to a cultural identity. It doesn't have to become a bad thing. But I do worry that when people feel like there is nothing to cling to, sometimes they gravitate towards an identity that's toxic or even dangerous. And
No, exactly.
and so it's this for me. This has kind of been the search for an identity that I can value, but also is positive. And I would say that this does take me closer to that.
I think it's the difference between, you can look back and say, this is who I am. This is where I come from, without having to think of it as superior to another person's coming from. And I think that's when we get into problems, when we start putting that pride into it, when we start putting it, instead of just taking it as a legitimate part of ourselves. So I see what you're saying. Like, if we could just go back and say, hey, this is still sort of part of my family's thinking now, and sort of how we came. The history is important. It's facts. And it creates a lot of who we are. But it is history and not what we are. So what I think you are is just the most intelligent guy who made me think. I still can't get over that Sleeping Beauty's 3 fairy things. Okay. I can't believe I missed that in the world. Now, when we talk about, so we went back, and so you're unlayering the stories, you're finding different things in them. You still don't have all the answers. Now, we talked earlier, this is his first book, people, so it's just amazing. I can't even imagine this being a first book. It is so in depth. We talked about the fact that, you're not rushing towards writing something else. This was a passion piece, something that you felt you needed to do, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm somebody who can write one thing one year, and then the next year I might scale back on some things, because it can be kind of a winding road for me. And so it's hard for me to write something unless I know that I can pretty much stand by it, and that it will at least be fairly consistent.
Troy has integrity.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, I would love to do it again. It could take some time, in all honesty.
Well, do you think that it could be the push of, like, you started a lot of work here, you made a lot of conclusions, but as you pointed out, you still don't have all the everything that you want that is there.
That's true. Yeah.
Do you feel like those questions are going to annoy you until you start again? Like, you seem to think a lot, Troy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still looking at things, definitely. It's challenging, though. I mean, the thing is, if you're always questioning, then you never actually end up publishing anything. So, I mean, you have to, at some point, you have to say that, yes, this is good enough to get out there, even if it's not perfect. It's good enough that it needs.
You have to make some stops.
Yes, it needs to be said,
because it will go on forever. No, I can see that, because you're making my thoughts go on forever from this book. So that was one of the things I wanted to ask you. Now, we both know I had enough problems coming up with questions about this, because it was so encompassing, and I wasn't quite sure where to start. And hopefully the audience doesn't notice that. But I was going to ask you, do you think being an academic, and while you were doing this, that helped you to find the focus you needed to put you're used to writing papers or coming up with, like, did that give you that extra boost to finish it, to just put it together and finish it?
Yeah, I would say that, it definitely helped me in some ways. I think, I have a lot of respect for the study of human culture, but it's also an area that, the moment you step into it, you're biased, basically. There's no way to get away from biases, preconceptions, and all of these other things. And, that's something that I can accept, but also, science does offer a lot of guidance on how to try to be objective. Even if you can never be perfectly objective, it's still something to, sort of strive for. And yeah, all this, sort of analytical stuff is part of that, that's part of how you check yourself to make sure that the thing that you're talking about actually exists and that you're not just sort of inventing it out of nowhere. So there's a lot of that basically.
So it's like, it's once again, the stories are down to earth, but so was your approach. This has to be real. This has to make sense. This has to come to a natural conclusion without any of my thoughts or opinions coming in. Right?
I wouldn't say
Basically.
there's none of my thoughts or opinions coming in.
Well,
but
I think you saved them for the introduction,
yeah,
which
maybe
we're not
so.
even getting into. There's a whole introduction with a whole lot of thoughts in there.
But yeah, I would go back to what I said earlier, which is that the things that I'm describing are real, at least. They're not completely of my own invention. Even though I have an interpretation of them, I didn't just take them out of nowhere, and that's important for me.
Yeah, you did the research. You did the work. And it's there. And I don't, in the text itself, in the book itself, I don't see I just saw, Slavic mythology according to Troy, the text. But I don't see a lot of personal in there. I see the work. I mean, the work is definitely there. And I think that's important to a lot of people, not just we get a lot of stuff thrown at us and it's like, this is there. I personally like to see the work. And I think you did a great job on that. Now, so we talked about the ideas behind death, the next life. And it's just all very grounded and down to earth, all of these things. So let's go into the whole morality aspect of stories. We all have the moral of the stories. And we talk about duality. We talk about the idea that there are two sides to us. And I found this very interesting, and most people see that as the angel on one shoulder and Satan on the other shoulder, arguing it out in our heads. But you propose that before Christianity, back in the even further days, that there was a duality and it consisted without a morality behind it. There were two sides without a morality. And this I find intriguing. And it put on the question list, so don't look like I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
Troy, help me understand this. Okay, you did in the book, but it's still a great big subject.
Right. So this is getting into the weeds a little bit. But just to give some background, so there are these stories, these creation stories in Eastern European folklore where God and the devil create the world together. And it looks very much like something out of, say, Mongolian mythology from much further east. And then to make it even more complicated, these creation stories from Mongolia and Siberia also have analogies in Native American mythology, which also has connections to Siberia. So there's a lot there that I won't try to completely summarize here. But in a nutshell, yes, these stories about the world being created by two figures, like, for example, in some Native American myths, you have Coyote and Little Coyote creating the world together. That's one of the versions that I talk about. That's very, very ancient. And actually, it's not just me saying that these Earth Diver creation myths are, tens of thousands of years old. There's quite a few scholars that would say that the Siberian and Native American Earth Diver creation myths are related if you go all the way back, to when they first started. So that's really not an unusual claim. What might be a little more contentious is, trying to project duality back into it. But even that's not a new idea. Now, as for how moral it is, that's really complicated because, the thing is, in a lot of these stories, one of the two figures can behave in a way that's kind of immoral. For example, Little Coyote introduces war. He comes up with the idea of, let's introduce different languages to people so that they fight with each other and, start wars with each other. And here's the thing, though. It doesn't tell you how to interpret that. That's just the end of the story. So even though you can sort of look at the story and say, I don't agree with what Little Coyote did, it doesn't explicitly tell you, oh, Little Coyote is the source of all evil. It just says, this is what he did. So it's kind of up to you to look at that story and judge for yourself, really, what that means. But the concept of a creation story with these two figures, and one of them behaving in a way that's kind of that might make you feel, kind of bad or negative, that goes back very far.
So it's up to you to interpret what. But,
right. There's not really a doctrine, and that's an important
Right.
difference. A doctrine says, okay, this is how you interpret that story. And also, it's a little vague because, okay, Little Coyote created a war, but does that mean that he only does bad things? Does that mean that everything bad is from him? That's where you start getting into more of a philosophical framework, which is one of the ways you can interpret that. I think that happened many times, but I don't think it was always so clear-cut if you look at all these stories.
Well, no, I mean, at the beginning, I believe it's at the beginning of that chapter, you talk about how the monks came and were just totally surprised and shocked that this is how the creation story had gone, that there was like God and Satan creating the world together. I'm assuming that's not what they originally intended to happen, but because they were used to a dual creation story, they just once again layered it, right?
Yeah, it must have been so easy to combine those concepts of the devil and God with this older one. It wouldn't have been difficult to synthesize them, basically.
And bring them together. But the balance, the two without the morality, speaks more of a reality of a God. Like they are not perfect. I think in a lot of the stories, the gods are not perfect. They're, they got their problems and issues. Okay, going on with snakes and dragons and siblings.
Yeah, this is a little off topic, but there's a really interesting one from the Hutzels in the Carpathian Mountains, the Ukrainian Highlanders, and in it they talk about one of these two figures telling the first lie, and they say from that first lie came all deception, but also dreams and poetry. So right there you have, basically lies mixed together with dreams and poetry, sort of a way of saying that, yes, there's a negative aspect to this new thing, but that's not all there is to it.
Well, there are people that still now consider imagination a lie, right? Like, if you're a writer out there, how many times have you heard a fiction? How many times have you heard, why are you talking about your characters like they're real? They're not real, and that's making them a lie. But so without lies, no, you wouldn't have poetry or stories or imaginations and dreams, because on one level they are not fact, they are not truth, but on the other level they are a certain kind of truth. I mean, myths take us to the bigger truths, such as loyalty and bravery, and it speaks of the bigger truths by using imagination. And you're thinking too much about what I'm saying, Troy.
No, I agree with what you're saying.
saying.
I mean, if ideas really didn't matter, we wouldn't debate them so much.
No, because basically with the internet on so many levels, we are fighting I'm not I don't do those things, but there is almost a war being fought. There's almost a war being fought through internets and social medias and things. And so you have to ask yourself, is any of that real? And if we keep going, we're just going to go right over to life is an illusion. We don't want to do that. Try. So we have the idea that they basically believed in this dualist creation story, right?
Well, yeah.
Is that the oldest story for creation you found?
So yeah, I do want to stress that, I don't really know when this arrived. I definitely say that this showed up in Eastern Europe before Christianization, because you had the Huns, that's pre-Christian. You had the Avars, you had the Bulgars, you had the Khazars. So I mean, you had these groups from the east who could have carried a lot of these Siberian myths into Eastern Europe. Um, but it's even though I think they're pre-Christian, I don't know
How far?
how long they were in Eastern Europe. And I would say it's really hard to find other creation myths in Eastern Europe. You do find hints of it. For example, there's also a story I mentioned from the Dove book, which is like an old manuscript from like the 1500s in Russia, which talks about another story that's Christianized, but it talks about basically Adam's body being divided up to form the moon, the sun, and the stars, and different sections of society. And I talk about how that's also a very ancient creation story, where you have basically a living being who gets divided up to create the world. And that might actually be the more archaic European belief. Whereas the duality, the stories featuring dualism, look very much like something out of Siberia. But I would say that the story with God and the devil has probably survived better in a Slavic folk tradition.
So even though they were isolated, as you said earlier, excuse me, there are a lot of influences coming in, like down like this. You have the stuff coming through Siberia, you have the stuff coming from Sweden into the Rus. There is like that whole connection further east, and the Mongolians. I mean, it's just a fact of life that all of this sort of merged
Yeah, that's
into.
part of why I do the comparative analysis, because it is a
Mhm.
melting pot culture, really.
And so you say that, well, we talked about there are times that this kind of um, myth, this kind of folklore, this area are interesting. Unfortunately, times like the Cold War, or there seems to be a resurgence. Um, but y- is there any other reason you can imagine that it was so neglected, or people have just been busy dealing with these other real life situations?
I think there have been a lot of barriers when it comes to cross-referencing things from different Slavic countries. I don't want to say that hasn't been done before, but even so, there are still so many barriers between the different countries in Eastern Europe. I'm not sure that anyone has really put it all together. I don't think that's really been done, because there's a lot of Slavic countries that basically speak languages related to this medieval group, called the Slavs, that migrated during the 6th century. They left a linguistic impression in Russia, obviously, in Ukraine, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and so on. And I don't think it's really been all put together, partially because it's extremely difficult. That's a lot of languages. Partially because maybe they didn't always want to study each other. So that could have bogged it down as well. And even though my book has a lot of great stuff, I still wouldn't say that it's over. I think it's far from over.
No, that's why I feel like in 5 years from now or something, you are going to be so irritated by those thoughts that you are going to write another one. They have to go somewhere. They can't just stay in your head. It will explode. And then we can look forward to more of these offerings, I guess I'll say. But it is a very interesting unfolding of connections. Like, it's just the work. It's just so thorough that I applaud. I applaud you, Troy.
Thank you.
This was just sent my way, and I'm really happy that it was on a lot of different levels. And I think we've kind of. Is there anything else? Okay, so let's sell. You can get this book on Amazon. Any other of the biggies?
Yeah.
It's available on Amazon. Probably Google, like just any of the platforms.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of reasons to read it. I know Vicky covered them. If you're interested in folklore, interested in Eastern Europe, interested in, the pre-Christian past, and yeah, also if you're interested in any of these cultures that are intertwined with Eastern Europe, like we've said, they have a close relationship to other European cultures that you might be interested in. You might even find some connections to Siberia. So there's a lot there that you can draw a connection to.
Or even if you're just interested in how Troy's brain works. Because it is there and it is interesting. I think curiosity, what you inspired is curiosity is an amazing way to live because it never ends. And it's the greatest adventure to find the answers to what you're looking for. No, you didn't find all the answers completely, but this is why 5 years from now, I'll be probably sitting down with you again. Seeing what is up in Troy's head then. I really appreciate that you came on and we took a shot at getting into this big stuff. and for clarifying some of the things that I needed clarified after it was read. And I hope, even if I come up with more questions on this one, because I certainly, I scanned it once, I delved into it the next time, and I still feel a couple of readings coming on here before I get it all. So I hope you enjoyed yourself, and we'll talk again. Okay, Troy? Okay.
Well, yeah, that's high praise, and I hope we did a good show. I appreciate it.
I'm sure that if we didn't, it's my fault. Troy. It's always Vicky's fault. Okay. You take care. We'll talk soon. Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
And we'll say goodbye to Troy. Okay. So yes, deep down digging to get to the answers, which is always exciting. I enjoyed myself. I hope you did too. I will see you all again next week. Until then, may your coffee be hot and your story sweet. Thanks for listening, everyone.